There's two ways of creating a scrollable content in SwiftUI. One of them is list and the other one is ScrollView. In this tutorial, I want to show you what you can actually do with lists. So we have a look at static views, building settings views, having a dynamic view. I use here some simple data with food. We can check how to add sections and also static elements together with dynamic ones. How to create a hierarchy. If you have a tree-like data structure or nested data structure like with folders and emails. Then one of the advantages of lists is that they have a very nice default styling that out of the box looks like your app belongs to the platform. And we have a look at the styling that SwiftUI provides. So this is plain, sidebar, inset grouped, and inset grouped. These are the ones that are available for iOS. There's also some additional ones for macOS, a little bit different, and also different ones for watchOS and tvOS. So I will show you an overview of these. A newer feature for SwiftUI is the availability to customize, for example, removing the background color, adding different cell colors. You can also add shapes if you want to. In this case, I actually use a different color depending on if it's a favorite or not. You can add insets, you can change the separator, you can hide the separators. So there's a lot of stuff available. And in order to not overly do this tutorial, I moved this in a separate one, so we explored it in that one. The other thing that is interesting with lists is that you get some default interactions. For example, I can make my list selectable. Actually, in this case, I customize the selected color. You can select multiple ones. This only works in edit mode. So I can select multiple of my food items. An example of why you would want to do this is here. Actually, I should have to go back in edit mode. I select multiple. And in this case, I show down here a button in the inset, edge insets, to make them favorite. SwiftUI has automatic ways of updating this. Also, if you add a new one, it animates this nicely. It animates it inwards nicely. You can't really change the animation. But that's a bit of a problem because it gives you so much default behavior. You just can't adjust a lot of the things. Other things that are interactable are swipe to delete, reordering lists. They actually have a lot of swipe actions, so you can also add a swipe from the left side and add multiple items. So lists are great for all of these interactions. Now, what's the difference between a list and a scroll view? Lists, you can only have one column. They are lazy loading, so that's really nice for this dynamic list if you have a lot of data that you want to load. Examples for scroll views on the right. So I have here one scroll view that is vertically scrolling, and I have two sections. Actually, I have three sections, and the first section is a horizontal scroll view. The second one is also a horizontal one. In the first one, I use a lazy H stack for this, and in the second one, I use a grid. So with scroll views, you can also do grids, horizontal and also vertical. Down here, I again have a lazy stack. Per default, you don't get a lazy only, which means only create these views when they are visible on the screen, when the user wants to see them. You don't have this behavior, that's why you need to use these lazy stacks. The other thing is because it's really plain scroll views, don't have a lot of styling, you can customize to your liking and add everything. So if you run out of options for your lists, scroll view is the good options. Then you can also do programmatic scrolling with scroll views. What you don't get yet with SwiftUI is paging behavior. You don't get the scroll offset. Newer things is also now you can actually disable scrolling. So I'm guessing their list and scroll views is one of these elements. They added a lot of new features each year. And luckily, a lot of them that they added recently are backwards compatible to iOS 13 and 14. I will also let you know when this is backwards compatible. And in some cases, I will also show you the difference between appearances on macOS and on iOS. Especially if you want to have a cross-platform app, lists are great because they automatically adjust to the platform. So we don't need to do so much work for this. Now, let's jump into code. I am going to create a new project, cross-platform, because I wanted to show you some of the elements, which also means that I have to write a little bit of conditionals for which platforms. And then because I want to use the newer features, I also have to write a little bit of when which platform, which versions of SwiftUI we allow to use this. So this is a list project. Now let's start by creating a static list, or one very simple example for a list, because I am going to add a lot of examples. I use here groups. So the first one is just with static list, and I'm creating a SwiftUI view where I create a settings view. This is one of the examples use cases, something with a menu where you select just like interactive buttons and sliders, or like the settings view here. Some login screens is also quite common. Similar to forms, there's not really a big difference between forms and lists on iOS. It is different on macOS. I'm going to show you in a minute. So we could here now add a list. List has a lot of initializers. We start with the very simple one with just content. So we could just add here texts of first, second, and third. Per default, one of the styles is always used. For the simulator, this is the inset group style. And I have here one section with all of these elements because I actually didn't specify this. Now this is obviously not the most interesting case, so I'm going to create a little bit of settings view. So for this I need a couple of properties. Let's say I have a username string, a boolean value if it's private, profile image size, font size. This is the default one. I'm using here I'm not going to connect this to anything. It's just to get something interesting to show. Now these are enough for a slider or text field and a toggle. And the other one I want to have is a picker. And I'm going to just use appearance. So we need to have enum definition for this picker. Just use your enum appearance style, dark light, and automatic. This is the one you get like with all the apps. Okay, we can now also add a state property for this. It's state private of our appearance style, and this is the default. Usually starts with auto. Now let's use them here. I can use a text field with title or username and binding to the username. One thing to note about lists is they also style your control views quite differently. The default for iOS is that there's no border around the text field, and I think this is especially for in lists it's quite useful. It looks better. Then we can add a toggle, private account, and use the other property for is private. So this one toggle, and a button. Just trying to find some elements that you usually have, saying sign out. Now I want to add a couple of other things for the image size, and they are going to go in a different sections. So I am creating a section with a header. Section has new initializers, and the one that you should use is the one with section, content, and header, because this is also backward compatible and it makes it easier to format the header. This is profile. So we have the title up here. Then I create another section. This is not the one with the title and content. This actually reminds me, I wanted to set the project to go down to iOS 14 and macOS 11. I can't really go further down because I use the new app lifecycle method here. Okay, this is a section for appearance where I want to use again a toggle, a slider, and a picker. So one slider for the font size. For default, the label is not shown. Then I want to have the picker, that was the whole point. So we have some different, I just want to add all the different ones. So this is then here with this menu style. And then the last section is maybe just an about section. content and header. The header is just a text with about, and in the content I want to show the version. And as you can see, you can build settings views very nicely. And now lists like this is very close to forms. I'm going to add another view that has the same UI elements as this one, but instead of a list, I'm going to use a form. So this is another file here, SwiftUI view, settings, form view. And just for simplicity, I'm copying everything. This is a test project, so I'm not trying to be here super smart with reusing my code. It's just easier to test everything if I make it actually simpler. Okay, I use now here a form instead of a list. As you can see a difference. I tried to find out about this in the documentation, and there's not a lot of information. So let me switch to Mac. So my settings view, when I use a list, looks like this. And it uses a different default style. This is not at all the way I like to have it. This is not the appearance that is looking good. Let's just have a look at form. This is looking much better. It has this 2-column style. For example, here for text field, I have the username and the text field with this box style. The button looks different, the sliders look different, and the pickers, you can obviously also change the picker style. The section headers, as you see here, for example, down here, this about or this appearance, they look a little bit off, and in the documentation, they said that you should stick with platform conventions and not use section headers. So I would remove this about header, for example. Now, how would this look like if we use the settings for Xcode? Instead of sections, you have a tab bar. So this is the sections that you use. So each of my sections that I had now would go in the tab bar for each of these tabs. Each of these tabs, I don't have extra sections as you see here. It's just all of these elements. And they pretty much look like what I have now in this form. Which means if you want to have a menu or settings view, on iOS you can stick with lists. For macOS you should use forms to get this proper forms and a tab view to get this nice platform conformance. Now the next example, instead of having predefined elements that I want to have in my list, with the static elements, we want to have a dynamic list. That means an array of data that changes every time I'm running, or that might change over time. So it's dynamically changing, and I want to use that in my list. In order to have something to show, because we're going to reuse this quite a lot, I need to add some data. So I'm creating here another group for data. And I add a food item, new file, Swift file, food. This is a struct, food. And I want to have a name, var name string, var icon. I like to have images, but I don't want you to import some images. So let's just stick with icons where I use a string. Var is favorite, which is a bool. Then I want to have some data for my previews. So I'm creating here a static function that creates me a couple of dummy ones. Static func preview, returning an array of food items. And here I return an array of food. So you can just add a couple and use emojis. So under edit, emojis and symbols, I can add an apple, and I'm using some of them with true and false. Let me just add more. So now I have 7 elements with different emojis and with different is true and false. So we have something to work with. Now I'm going to create another group for dynamic list where we use our food item in the first view. So this is again a SwiftUI view, and I name this food list view. First I need to have my data, which is my foods, and I can use here this preview. I am not changing this data in this view currently, so I can just leave it as a let. If you know you're going to edit this, you can also make this a state private var. Now I can use here a list, and when I create a list in this case, we have a look at the initializers. So the content, I could use the content, but I'm starting with the data. So here you give a, no wait, this is not the binding. So here you see, this is the first one is a binding. This is if you want to make the list items editable. You can use a range or a random access collection. So just a collection like we have now. So I use my foods, and what you get back here is something that is identifiable. So this is my food in. I do get an error because my content needs to conform to identifiable. This is really important because I can make this list update very weirdly if I don't use this correctly. If you don't want to use identifiable, you can use the ID. Key path is how you specify the property that we want to use. So this is /dot, and now you can choose one of these three. So it's icon, favorite, or name. And I can add here text with the food's name. Okay, I go back to iOS. To make this look a little bit more interesting, I directly use an HStack, so I can use the icon too. This is the text foods icon. In order to show you the importance of this ID, I'm going to create an example that gives a really weird updating. And I'm going to add a button where we create new food items and add them to this array. And I use the toolbar modifier to create here this add button. You don't see it because it needs to be in a navigation view. So navigation view, we can also use the new navigation stack. So I have here this plus button, and we can decide what to do. So for example, let new food is a food name new. I can leave the icon empty or use here a question mark, and favorite false. Now I can, once I have this item, I can append this to my foods array. Okay, now let's create this. When I press, this foods array is added. The list, because it is a state property, the list automatically updates and adds this one element. If you want to have this animated, you can wrap with animation block. Now it's animating nicely. This looks fine, but actually this is not showing this correctly. It actually shows the same one all the time because I'm using the same ID for both of this element, which is the name, and this is the same. So for the icon, I'm using now a trick. So I just use the foods count. So I have 7 of these items. When I press plus, I create an icon with number 7. It's just a trick to show you this. And this is 7. Now I have 8 elements, and the next one should have an icon with 8. But you see it's still 7. And it stays 7. Also, no matter how many I am adding. This is because all of them have the same name, the ones I add, which is new. So the list identifies them as the same, and it uses the same cell, the same display for all of them. So basically my data that is underneath is correct. It's just the list that is confused because I set up my identifiable wrong. Let's fix this. And instead of the name, I'm going to add a UUID, a unique identifier. This is ID, UUID. I can directly create here UUID. I can go back to my list, and instead of the name, I use the ID for the ID. And now if I add more elements, I'm adding them correctly, and the icons, this fake data shows correctly with 7, 8, and 9. This is why it's always a good idea to use unique identifier. And most of the times, for example, if you get your data from a server, it has an ID, a UUID anyway. So we actually use this. I used here the ID key path, but since I have an ID, I can directly make food here conform to identifiable. Identifiable has one requirement, which is that you have to have a property with name ID. That has to be hashable, I think. Let's just check, jump to definition. Yes, you see here that this ID has to be hashable. Now, I did create a property that is called ID directly. If you, for whatever reason, had here a different name, for example, if it comes from your server and you don't want to rename this, you can create an ID which is a computed property. I use also UUID and return here key. So now when the list looks for the identifier, looks for the ID property, uses this computed property and uses the key underneath. So this is an easy way of making things identifiable, but I'm going back to just calling it ID. This is simpler. Now that I have made this identifiable, my list becomes shorter and I don't require here to have this ID property. Specify the ID key path. I get again my proper updating. Another thing that you might want to do when you have dynamic data is you have multiple of data arrays. So I'm just going to create a new file, SwiftUI view, with a complex list view. Create. I can again use my preview data, but let's say I have another array. In this case, it's unhealthy foods. I'm just going to create this here. This is one pizza food and one burger. So now I have these two arrays that I want to show. If I have two, instead of using the list with data, I use again the list and a for each. For each has very similar initializers like the list. Here, this is from a range of integers, from a binding if you want to make something changeable, editable. And again, here my random access collection initializer. So I use food, and I can use here text with the food's name. And I'm adding another for each for my unhealthy foods, again showing the food's name. And now I have both of these arrays in one section, in one list. You can add multiple of this for each, but you can also combine for dynamically data with our foods here with static ones. For example, I could add a plus button down here. Actually, we can just use the plus button that I had before. So this is now appearing together in one list. If you work with the same data, one thing I might want to do now is create a reusable custom cell. Because I have here two for each that uses the same data type, and I don't want to copy paste here the text view and the icon view. How do we create a cell? This is very easy, much easier than for UIKit. You can just create another SwiftUI view. Okay, let's do this in a new file to build up a little bit. So this is a food custom cell view, and I guess I'm just going to copy this view and we modify it from there. So I'm just copying the body with the properties. Now I can command click on text and use extract subview, and I name this food raw, and the food raw needs to have the food properties, and we can use this in the for each. I can reference the food raw and pass the food for both my healthy foods and my unhealthy ones. I can then here continue working on this food raw or this custom cell. So we had before also showing this icon. So I can use text food.icon and then maybe showing a heart symbol depending on is favorite. I show a heart dot fill or just a heart if it's not favorite. So I have these icons, and maybe we want to move them to the right edge, so I add a spacer in between. Since I'm going to use this food raw quite a lot, I don't want to, it's a little bit hidden here, so let's just move this into its separate file. Again, SwiftUI view, food raw. It is complaining because I have this struct definition now twice. So let's quickly cut this out and move this over and add a example in the preview. So there's not much going on in the preview. You can add a padding. Okay, I'm going to use this food raw quite a bit. This helps me to keep my views shorter, and it also helps in making this tutorial shorter. Okay, now that I have here more complex data, I'm starting to lose an overview of what I have in my view, and I like to organize my list a little bit, for example with sections. I'm going to create a new group, organize list, and we start with a SwiftUI view where I can use the section food list view. As I already said, I basically just want to make the view where I had different types of foods a little bit more organized. So again, copy paste this sample data over to the new view, and we can use here around this for each one very easy one way of when you have different categories of data is to use a section. You could use a section with just content. Now my first healthy foods here is in one section, and I have here, because of the styling, a separator area. I can also wrap my second for each in a section. Now it's nicely in 3 different categories. To make this easier for the user, we're going to add headers. For example, this is unhealthy foods, which now appears here. And another header for my first one, healthy foods. It applies some default styling. The nice thing about this new initializers is that you can give back here a view, which means you can change the font to large title. Another thing that you can do is use the header prominence to make this increased. This is newer for iOS 15. And I am going to use the last option, which is the whole section food list, adding a available. And then I need to do the same here for the preview. Okay. In this case, my header gets larger and bold and darker, and this is the default one. Now, if you want to make this section collapsible, like just one section, you can use a disclosure group. So this closure group, you have to give the title, and this is actually the same as I had here my section. So it's double now with the section header and this header, so I'm removing this section header. And it's also adding some insets. If you want to have one section collapsible, then you can use a disclosure group in the section. If you want to have all of them collapsible, you can use a list style of sidebar. We'll come to this in a minute. Now the next thing that you might want to do for organizing your code, your UI, your lists, is if you actually have some nesting, like a lot of levels of showing and hiding this. And I'm just going to use the example from the documentation because I don't know a lot of other situations where I have something that recursively calling itself. So here I am adding a new type. This is a file item. Again, it has to be identifiable. We're working with lists. I have here an ID. This is just giving it a title name, a folder file name. It might be either a folder or a file. The problem is because I need to recursively call the same type, I can't have two different types for folder and file. It needs to be the same type encapsulated. And here I'm just saying if it's a folder or file by this one property. You could also use here if it has children or not. And because it's like a tree structure, it's like this file item, what's its children? Does it have, if it's a folder, does it have subfolders? Does it have files? And this is the same data type that I have here. In order to work with the list, it needs to be an optional array. And again, for the previous, I created here this dummy data, or just for easier working. For example, I create here an array of file items with 3 different folders. There, I set the folder property to 2. The first one is inbox, the second one is archived, and the last one is trashed. The trash doesn't have any children. The other doesn't have. Like the first one has 2 files. So this would be a email inbox example, where the second one is then archive. We have one subfolder for work and one for personal. Both of them have some files in them. So I have like 3 levels of nesting, a little bit of variation. And we can use this by creating a new view, which is a hierarchical list view, where I use again my example data at state private file items with this preview data. Usually I wouldn't have this here, it would come somewhere from a view model from where I fetch it. Then we use a list, and I go for the initializers, and the one I'm looking for is with children, because this is the one that creates me this tree-like structure. So I have data binding. I don't want to edit anything. I use the second one with the random access collection and children. So the data is my file items, and the children is a key path. This is again the proper, what do we call recursively? And I conveniently called this here children. I could have also named this sub file items. So now the list knows, I have to recursively call this one and create more cells. So this is the file item. And here I can make a text with file item .title. Okay, and I said my dummy data, preview data, has 3 different sections: inbox, archive, and trash. Per default, each of the sections is collapsed. You can see this here on the right with this toggle. If I press it, shows the sub files. This archived one, I did have 2 subsections, subfolders, because they are folders, because they have folders and they have children. You see again, I can further open this for both of them. So you have this structure. And for nicer seeing here what is a file and folder, and I'm actually using a label. If it's a folder, I use folder icon, and if it's not, then I use an envelope icon, because this is some email structure. As you see, we have some very nice looking UI for these nested structures, but there's a lot of limitations for this. You have to use the same data types. You could encapsulate different data types in one. You can't really, per default, hide and toggle this. The other thing I didn't say is my file item types need to be hashable. And I can only use here one array. Like for the other arrays for healthy and unhealthy, I can't do this. You have to combine this into one array, because it only works with list. For each doesn't have this. You can additionally also use here the selection, so this is also working in the editing. But it's really just this one recursively calling itself data that works with this list children. You can, if you have something more complex, create your own tree-like structure. And you can, for example, what I had here, use this disclosure groups to recursively call itself. Now, in order to see more of the styling options, I'm going to show you how to style lists and what you have to pay attention to in a new group, which is styling. So first I'm going to create just one list styling view. I just need to have some data, and because I'm lazy, I'm going to reuse here the part where we had the sections. So I copy the body into my new view, and I'm just going to remove the part with this disclosure group and use a header instead. And we are removing the header prominence. The other thing I actually didn't use is footers. For example, you can add a footer. Usually you use footers to describe the section, so it's easier to understand what you want or just some additional information. For example, for unhealthy foods, I can have a text saying you should try to avoid them. And for the healthy ones, we add a text saying try to eat them regularly. Now we have here the 3 sections for these examples, and I'm just going to use the preview because now I have this one list and I can change the styling with the list style view modifier. And automatic is actually calling one of the others depending on the situation and platform. What you see in this situation is actually the inset group. This is the inset group. So let's just add a couple of more. Then maybe we start with plain. And I use here actually preview display names, so I can easier see when I tap here. This is the plain one. You don't have this gray background, these boxes. It's just one simple list. It's also changing some of the UI elements appearance. If you have a look at this add button, the separator starts with add, and this add, the text is actually black, whereas in the inset group, it is highlighted in the accent color. Okay, adding more of the other ones, like inset. I don't really see a lot of difference between inset and plain, but this is also depending on the platform, and they also changed a little bit with each iOS version, because why not? Then we use grouped. So now you have this grouping, but the row goes to the whole width. Whereas in inset group, you have these groups, but also their inset. And then the last one is sidebar. Sidebar looks very close to inset group. You also have these groups, but they add here this toggles to show and hide the sections, to collapse the sections. For the last one, it doesn't have it because it's just one element. And also what is this add button is actually different. Again, I have the text in black, whereas in inset group it was highlighted with the accent color. Now to explain again this automatically applying, I'm going to add another simple view where we see this going. New file. This is SwiftUI view. This is an environment list view, so just the example of what happens with this what is the automatically selected style depending on the situation. For example, if I have a very common situation of a navigation view with a list styling, and maybe I just add here navigation title, master, actually this is, let's just say first and second. So the first view, what is the styling that we are seeing? I have here this disclosure button, so it's list style with the first view and navigation view and navigation stack, navigation split view gets this sidebar style, and the second one gets plain or inset. Now let me just change my device to an iPad, because then we can see this. I didn't add here a navigation link. And I use here the canvas device settings, enabling orientation, so we have the landscape mode, and which means that I can see both of these columns. So the master, then it's a master detail style. Or you can just run the project, and I'm going to use this view in my main content in horizontal. Now you see I have this master detail style. The master gets the sidebar style with this collapsible button, and the main content gets the grouped. insert grouped. You can also try to run this for lower versions like iOS 14. I think on iOS 14 it was different. This is iOS 14.2. On the left, I still have the sidebar style. So they look pretty close. Okay, there's some differences here with these icons. And this is not good. And with the separators, distances. But at least the sidebar is close. The detail view uses very different styles. Also, actually, the styles look different for different versions. For iOS 14, this is the plain list style. So something you should be aware of, that maybe in this case, setting for the detail a specific styling is actually the better option. Just so you have it everywhere the same. There's only a difference. iOS 15 is the same as iOS 16, I think. So that one you don't need to pay attention to. Then you can also check this for macOS. And now I need to actually change the... And now it's giving me an error because grouped and insert group doesn't exist. Just going to reorder this. And add here a... hashtag if is iOS. Hashtag end if. You can also add a else if. Else. This is then the macOS version. For example, you have bordered and this inset with alternating backgrounds. So I'm just going for now adding here one with the alternate background too. And this is also one of the newer ones. So I add a version check. No, wait, what did it do? So if I'm on else, if I'm on macOS, and if I'm higher on with these versions, and I have some other problems, the header prominence. So this one is not available on macOS. If OS, then I use the header prominence and otherwise not. Go back to my list styling. Okay, we have plain list style. Looking then inset. There is some distance here. Bordered alternate background. The headers are a little bit strange, but this is, as I already mentioned, on macOS you're not supposed to use headers, so they always look strange. And then sidebar. In this case, these texts are great because they are disabled. They don't do anything. They're not detectable. So once you have your buttons or something, navigation links, they will be enabled. They will look enabled. I did make a short summary for lists. And I also added this table where you can see the different styles. So we have the 5 styles available for iOS. Then the ones for macOS with the additional bordered and alternate backgrounds. That came with iOS 12. WatchOS only has plain, carousel, and elliptical. I guess it's because you don't want to have a grouped or inset on WatchOS because the screen is already so small. If you inset it, then there's just no more space. On tvOS, you have plain and grouped. So this is a short help in case you are interested in making your app work on all these platforms, or some of these platforms, multiple of these platforms. In case you're looking for more customizations, List now has options to customize the list raw background. This takes a view, so you can also add shapes. You can change the list raw separator tint. So this is available from iOS 15. The list raw background is also for iOS 13, so this one you can use for all of them. You can change the list raw insets. This is what I used here to add an inset on the leading and trailing edge to this section. So you see the pizza icon is moved inwards. Then we have list raw background. If you also want to change everything here. If you want to change the title foreground colors, this is the normal one. They have a different one for section separators, so you can change this separator differently from the raw separators. I used here an inset style, and if you want to get rid of this gray background, you can say scroll content background is hidden. And then this is a newer view modifier that is not backward compatible. And the reason for this, I think, is that for iOS 16, for these SwiftUI 4th iterations, they changed the way these lists are implemented. Instead of UI table view that they previously used, they're now using UI collection views. The other thing that is available is if you want to change the height of one of these cells, the default height, you can add here, you can change the environment property for default minimum list height, header height. They also have default minimum list row height. So you can make them higher. I just changed here the header height. If you want to see more detail of all of these options, you can have a look at the other tutorial, which I will link. But as you can see, there's quite a lot. You can do more with lists. Thankfully, no. And we're going for the last section, which is user interaction. So I would want to add two cases, one for a single selection, list view. There's obviously more things you can do with lists than just selecting things. And then multiple selection, list view. So in this case, again, I need to have some data. And I'm using again my dummy data. Now when we use the list and go again for this initializers, there is some with selection. Again, no, wait, not this one. Not this one. The one with random access collection, selection with a binding hashable, and then we get the raw content. So I'm using this. We use the healthy foods. I need to have a binding to an hashable property. Obviously, I need to have here a state property for selected food. This is a food, optional, nil. Then I use the binding to this food item property, food, and we use here the food raw for this food. And yes, I forgot to make my food hashable. So maybe I'll just per default make everything identifiable and hashable. If I now use my lists and I try to interact, you can't see anything. Somehow the selection doesn't work with the items. It needs to be a selected food ID, so I use UID because it's like the identifier. The list already uses the ID for managing, so it also uses the same ID for the selection, so you need to use the same property type for all of them. So for the ID, identifier, and the selected property need to be the same type. And now if you tap here, you can actually select this. Just for fun, I'm also going to show you, because I didn't show you so much customization, list raw background. We can use here, if the selected food ID is my food's ID, I use color.gray. And otherwise I use color.tertiary. I use a system background color, which is tertiary background, system background. This is because it nicely works for, I tried a couple of them, and this one works also in dark mode. Okay, and now tap. The default color is still the same, and if you tap, it gets green. You can also toggle here dark mode. And you can still select, and it's the same background color. Okay, I go back to light mode. In case you only want to select one element, this selected property needs to be just an optional of one value, which means, as you see here, the only possibilities for this property is nil or it has a value. So it can only be one selected at a time. If you want to have multiple, we need to change this to a collection. So I'm just going to grab this, copy and paste it over here so we can redo this. So this is now a selected foods IDs. And for selecting something, a collection, that is actually not order. Usually it's a good idea to use a set. I don't need to have here this nil optional. We start with an empty one, and I need to use here, I renamed this property. And I take out the background color for now. You can do the same. It just needs to be, you then would need to say, if the selected, these foods ID is contained in this array, then I use my favorite color, my green color. If you tap now here, this is again the single selection. In order to have multiple selected, we need to go in edit mode. For iOS, we need to put this in a common way of putting this is in the toolbar. Toolbar, content, edit, button. So now we can select multiple of these elements. Just as one more example for what you would do. We have with iOS 15 also the save area inset. So you can add something down here in the insets. For example, it would be actually something that is above the scroll view, the list in this case. So I use this save area insets to my list. If I have something selected, if the foods IDs count is higher than 0, then I show a button that says mark as favorite. I go through all the selected food IDs. I find the index because I need to change the values in this array. That's the data that my list uses. That's the one I have to change. When I do this, then the list gets updates accordingly to this data. Try again, edit, and then press on mark as favorite, and I change the data. And because this is a state property, the list recognizes changes and updates its UI accordingly with the new data. I hope this gave you a lot of input of what you can actually do with lists, how to organize your list, how to work with your list, how to properly get the updates with this identifiable, how to add sections and list styles, and where this is actually important. If you want to learn more, you can check out my next tutorial where I show you how to do this customization of the list rows and the backgrounds with a lot more interesting stylings. So check that one out. Like this video if you found it helpful. Until next time, happy coding!